My boss's wife was a close friend. She once told me, I trust him completely. Then one night, I stayed late at the office. And walked in on him and his assistant. They laughed, until they saw me. He stammered, "This stays between us." I smiled and said, I was about to say the same thing. To your wife. The next morning, his office was empty. So was his home. I was never supposed to be the one to find out. I had worked at the company for almost 10 years. It was a good job, not something I had dreamed of as a kid, but it paid well, and I was good at it. My boss, Richard, was the kind of man who made things happen. He had that effortless confidence, the type of presence that made people sit up straighter when he walked into a room. His wife, Laura, was just as striking, but in a different way. She had a kindness to her, the kind that made you feel at ease. She wasn't just Richard's wife to me. Over the years, she had become a friend. Not the kind you meet for brunch every weekend, but the kind you respect, the kind you actually enjoy talking to. She trusted him completely. She told me that once. It was after an office party, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I had stayed behind to help clean up, and she was waiting for Richard to finish a phone call. We were chatting, and somehow, the conversation turned to trust. She had laughed, shaking her head. You know, people always ask me if I worry, if I ever feel insecure about him being around younger women at work. But I don't. I trust him completely. I remember thinking how nice that must be, to be so sure of someone. That memory would come back to me over and over again. Especially after that night. That night when I walked into his office and saw something I was never supposed to see. It was a Thursday, late in the evening. Most of the office had cleared out hours ago, but I was still there, trying to finish up a report that Richard had insisted on having first thing in the morning. I wasn't in a rush. It was one of those nights where the quiet of the office was almost peaceful. The hum of the vending machine, the distant sound of traffic from the streets below, it was the kind of silence that made you feel productive. I had just finished typing the last sentence when I realized I needed to drop the report off in Richard's office. I figured he had already left, but his door was cracked open. That's when I heard it. A laugh. Not just any laugh. A woman's laugh. For a second, I thought maybe Laura had come by. She did that sometimes, stopped in to bring Richard dinner or pick him up after work. But then I heard another laugh. A man's this time. His. Something about it made me stop. I should have walked away. I should have pretended I didn't hear anything. But I didn't. I stepped closer, and before I could even think about it, I pushed the door open. And there they were. Richard. And Megan. Megan was his assistant. She had started about 2 years ago, fresh out of college. She was smart, quick on her feet, and eager to prove herself. She had always been professional. Or at least, I had thought she was. They hadn't even noticed me at first. They were still laughing, caught up in their own little world. Then Richard turned his head and saw me. The laughter stopped. Megan's face went pale. Richard, for the first time since I had known him, looked completely speechless. For a long second, none of us moved. Then Richard spoke. His voice was calm, steady, like he was still in control. This stays between us. I could feel my heart pounding. Not out of fear, out of anger. I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. I was about to say the same thing, to your wife. And just like that, the color drained from his face. Richard's whole body tensed. Megan took a step back like she was hoping she could disappear. The confidence he had a second ago? Gone. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He was thinking. Calculating. Trying to figure out if I was bluffing. You don't want to do that, he said, his voice quieter now. I tilted my head, pretending to think about it. No, I think I do. Megan's eyes darted between us. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Maybe she realized there was nothing she could say. Richard took a step toward me. Let's be smart about this, he said, voice smooth again. You and I, we go way back. You've got a good job here, a stable life. No need to mess that up. Ah. There it was. The threat hidden inside the friendly tone. I let out a small laugh. You think I care about this job more than Laura deserves to know the truth? His jaw clenched. Then Megan finally spoke. She stopped, glanced at Richard, then looked down at the floor. She wasn't going to defend herself. She wasn't going to ask me to keep quiet. She already knew this was bigger than her. Richard exhaled sharply. What do you want? I blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. He folded his arms. What do you want? A raise? A promotion? More time off? Whatever it is, let's talk. I stared at him. He really thought this was something he could bargain his way out of. Like this was just another business deal. Before I could respond, a sound echoed down the hall. Footsteps. Someone was still here. Megan sucked in a breath. Richard's head snapped toward the door. He grabbed my arm and yanked me back inside, shutting the door almost all the way. I wanted to yank my arm away, but the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. The footsteps got closer. For a second, I thought maybe it was security. But then a familiar voice called out from the hallway. Richard? Are you still here? It was Laura. My stomach dropped. Richard froze. So did Megan. She was early. She was supposed to be at a dinner with friends. She wasn't supposed to be here. Richard let go of my arm so fast it was like he had been burned. He turned to Megan, whispering, not a word. Then, to me, he whispered, you say anything, and I promise you'll regret it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because at that moment, Laura pushed the door open the rest of the way. And saw all three of us. For a second, nobody moved. Laura stood in the doorway, holding Richard's coat over her arm. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at dinner with friends. That's what he had told me earlier in the day. That's what I had assumed. She looked at me first. Then at Richard. Then at Megan. Her eyes lingered on Megan just a little too long. It was quick, but I saw it, the shift in her face. The flicker of realization. She wasn't stupid. Richard, to his credit, reacted fast. He forced a smile, stepping toward her like this was any other night. Laura, what are you doing here? Laura lifted the coat slightly. You forgot this. Richard nodded like this made perfect sense. Ah, thank you, sweetheart. He reached for the coat, his wedding band flashing under the office lights. But Laura didn't hand it over. Her eyes moved back to me, searching for something. I didn't speak. I could have. I should have. But something in the way Richard was looking at me held me back. His words from a moment ago echoed in my head. You say anything, and I promise you'll regret it. I didn't know what he meant by that. But I knew him well enough to know it wasn't an empty threat. So I stayed silent. Laura turned her attention to Megan. I didn't know you were working late tonight. Megan stiffened. I was just finishing up some paperwork. Paperwork, Laura repeated. Her tone was calm, but her fingers gripped the coat a little tighter. Richard forced a chuckle, shaking his head. Come on, let's not make this weird. I had a few things to wrap up, Megan was helping, and Laura turned back to me. And what were you doing in here? She was testing me. I could feel it. I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, Richard cut in. I asked them both to stay late. We were discussing some upcoming projects. That was the moment I realized just how far he was willing to go. He wasn't just trying to cover for himself. He was trying to pull me into it. Make it seem like I had been in on this from the start. If I told the truth now, it wouldn't just be him she lost trust in. It would be me too. And that's exactly what he wanted. A distraction. A way to muddy the water. I could feel Laura watching me. Waiting. If I told her now, in this moment, Richard would twist it. Turn it into some office drama, a misunderstanding. And if I hesitated for even a second? She'd start doubting me instead. Richard had put me in check. I could stay silent and keep her trust. Or I could speak, and risk losing everything. I swallowed hard. I needed to think. But I didn't have time. Because at that exact moment, Laura's phone rang. She pulled it out of her purse, glanced at the screen, and frowned. It's Kristen, she muttered. Kristen was one of her closest friends. She answered. Hey, I thought you were at dinner? A pause. Then Laura's face changed. She wasn't just frowning now. She was confused. Then her eyes widened, and I saw her jaw tighten. Her grip on Richard's coat white-knuckled. Something was wrong. She turned her back slightly to us, lowering her voice. What? No, I don't understand. Why would he? Another pause. Then she turned around, looking directly at Richard. And for the first time that night, he looked nervous. She ended the call without another word. And when she spoke, her voice was ice cold. Richard, do you want to explain why my credit card was declined tonight? For a moment, the room was so quiet that I could hear the distant honking of a car outside. Laura's eyes stayed locked on Richard, her expression unreadable. But I saw it, how her breathing had changed, how her fingers tightened around the phone. Richard, to his credit, didn't immediately panic. His mind was working fast, trying to find a way to spin this in his favor. That's strange, he said smoothly, forcing a small chuckle. I'll take a look at it in the morning. Maybe the bank flagged something. Kristen paid for my dinner. Laura cut him off. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were sharper now. Daring him to lie to her. She said it was declined twice. Richard hesitated for half a second. But that was enough. Laura wasn't just suspicious anymore. She knew. I watched as something inside her shifted. A small thread of doubt she had never pulled before was suddenly unraveling, fast. She turned to me. Did you know about this? I felt a lump in my throat. This was it. The moment. Richard's warning flashed through my head again. You say anything, and I promise you'll regret it. I had a choice. I could stay silent and let Richard continue his performance. Let him spin a new lie, let him manipulate her into thinking she was crazy for even questioning him. Or, I could tell her the truth. I looked at Megan. Her face was frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wouldn't say a word. She wasn't going to risk her job, her reputation, whatever this had been for her. But I wasn't Megan. I took a slow breath, then spoke. Laura, I said, my voice steady. He's lying. Silence. Richard took a sharp step toward me, his face twisted in pure rage. You don't know what you're talking about. I ignored him. I turned fully to Laura. I stayed late to finish a report. I was dropping it off in his office when I walked in on them. I nodded toward Megan. They weren't working. Megan flinched, but she didn't deny it. Laura's lips parted slightly. She blinked once. Twice. Then she looked at Richard. Tell me he's lying. Richard ran a hand down his face, letting out a dry laugh. Come on, Laura, this is ridiculous. Tell me he's lying. Her voice cracked. That's when I knew. She had already figured it out. Maybe not all of it, but enough. Richard must have realized it too, because his whole demeanor shifted. His shoulders dropped. The mask slipped, just a little. Laura, his voice softened, taking on a new tone. Can we talk about this privately? No one word. Firm. Unshakable. She turned to Megan, who had barely moved this whole time. How long? Megan opened her mouth, but no words came out. Laura exhaled sharply, nodding like she had expected that. Then she looked back at Richard, and for the first time all night, I saw pure disgust in her eyes. All these years, she whispered, almost to herself. I defended you. I told everyone you were different. Richard's jaw clenched. Laura, please, let's just, how long, she demanded. He didn't answer. That was his answer. Laura took a shaky breath, then stepped back. You don't have to come home, she said. Richard blinked. Laura, she turned to me. Can you give me a ride? I nodded without hesitation. And just like that, she walked out. I followed, but not before glancing back one last time. Richard was standing there, stunned, like he couldn't believe this was happening to him. Megan looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. I didn't say another word. I just walked away. The car ride was quiet at first. Laura stared out the window, hands folded tightly in her lap. Then, finally, she spoke. I always thought if something like this happened, I would feel it. That I would just know. She let out a bitter laugh. But I didn't. I didn't know what to say. Anything I could offer felt useless. She turned to me suddenly. Why did you tell me? I met her gaze. Because you deserved to know. She nodded slowly, then looked away. By the time I dropped her off, she seemed different. Not broken, not even devastated. Just done. She turned to me before getting out of the car. Thank you. That was the last time we really talked. I heard through mutual friends that she filed for divorce almost immediately. Richard didn't fight it. He packed up his office, left town, and from what I've gathered, started over somewhere else. As for Megan, she quit a few weeks later. I stayed. I don't regret telling Laura. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that moment before she walked in. The moment where Richard still thought he had everything under control. And I wonder if, deep down, he knew this was always how it would end.